This month I took part in the Soap Challenge Club again. Out of the two categories, I chose the Cold Process Soap Challenge. I had this mould which with slightly rounded edges, and I wanted to try and see what that looked like compared to my slightly bigger mould with the more squared edges. As a third type of mould, I wanted to use these stone-shaped molds, which worked beautifully last year in a similar type of challenge of stones. I tried to use different kinds of salts. This one was the Himalayan pink salt, which was coarse. Then I also used the normal sea salt. Again, the coarse form, although this was slightly finer than the Himalayan salt, and then also a little bit of the really fine sea salt. For fragrance for this first trial, I used the Fresh Linen fragrance oil that I really like. Unfortunately, this particular one has been discontinued, which is why it's not part of any of my assessments, but it's got a beautiful smell. I also chose this purple mica from Soak Rochford, a really beautiful purple colour. I thought for part of my batch I would mix it with a little bit of charcoal to make it a little darker purple. And I thought about having a third part which I mixed with a little bit of a sky blue, which is from Easy Colours. And to give the whole batch the white look as part of the soap, I added some titanium dioxide. I started by adding a little bit of the Himalayan pink coarse salts to the molds. In the rectangular molds, I put it in the corners so it would kind of add a little bit of a broken side part onto it. In the stone-shaped molds, I put it right in the center to create a little hole with the salt in the middle. I then added a little bit of the slightly finer but still coarse sea salt to all the corners and tried to mix it up a little bit here. Once I had added the coarse sea salt to all the different molds, I then added a little bit of the fine sea salt. Now, in hindsight, I'm not sure this was the best method, but as you will find out soon, something went completely wrong with this whole batch anyway. So it may have worked, but in this particular case here, I don't think it quite worked. I would like to retry that again, as I try to spread it around a little bit more to create that finer detail in the center of the soap as well. Once my molds were prepped, I then divided my batch into 3 larger portions and 1 tiny portion. You will see in a second what this was for. The 3 bigger portions were all slightly different amounts to give the soap a main color added with different shades to it. Here is the tiny amount, which was going to be the really dark shade that I was going to use. Now here you can see I've added some charcoal. I chucked that in first and then started adding on the different colours. Here's a little bit of the blue sky mica. And I also added some purple planet mica and gave this a good stir here. You can see this creates quite a dark purple. It's still recognizable as purple, but it is quite a dark greyish colour. That's obviously thanks to all the charcoal I added to this particular portion. This second portion had only the purple planet mica added to it. This was going to be a main portion and had the biggest amount of a mix in the pot. The third portion I had kept completely white by adding some titanium dioxide only. And my plan was to swirl these all nicely together. I started by adding some of the main purple into the mold. I added this in the center where there was no salt to make sure that the salt grains would not be moving around the mold too much. I then wanted to add the different shades and create really lovely swirls. As you will see by the end product, this didn't quite work out as I'd planned, even though here you can see they move nicely around and it creates a lovely swirl. It doesn't really show in the end product that nicely, unfortunately. You will see in my later takes that I take a different technique to this to make sure that the colors blend in and create nicer swirls with the different techniques. I'm still quite happy with the actual look of this soap here. The main problem with this particular one was really the oven process that I used, and I will explain in a second what happened there. Here is my tiny amount of very dark colour. I've added a lot of charcoal to this. I should have probably lifted this little container higher up for this to create almost like a bit of a drop swirl, basically making sure that the actual dark colour got all the way through, and maybe the bat had also thickened a little bit too much for this tiny amount to really reach all the way through. I repeated those steps in my other mold. You can see here I used the really fine sea salt as well. It worked nicely. It didn't move the salt around at all. But as a result, the way I did this here, there was a lot of purple on the surface of the finished product, with the colours not blending into each other that nicely. Again, maybe if I lifted this up slightly higher, but as you can see, I didn't have that much colour left. So the dark layer, unfortunately, kind of sat on top of, in this case, on top of the purple. The white did break through a little bit, but not to the extent that I had hoped for initially. And obviously here with a very dark one, you can see it's really, I'm lifting up the container very high, but it's just not enough mix to really break through the previous layers, unfortunately. And finally, with these stones, I tried to swirl them in. Really didn't quite work very well with that first one. Worked better with the next ones, but still, I mean, the end products are quite nice, but it's not what I planned initially. And here it is, my first attempt of this month's soap challenge, the cold process crystal soap. I'm actually quite happy with the look of this. The main mistake I made here was I had set the oven to 170 degrees. It was the lowest setting on my oven, but unfortunately it was 170 degrees Celsius, not Fahrenheit. So unfortunately, my soap completely overheated, and I will show you a picture at the end of what it actually looked like in the end. Unfortunately, really not what I was after. Still lovely, but really not what I was after. And here we have got the product in its full glory. As you can see, we've got some purple color that really just doesn't quite look that natural. We have got white, which works fine. And we've got some pink Himalayan salt that really just doesn't go with the rest of it at all. So even if the actual oven process had not completely destroyed my product, I don't think this would have been the prettiest soap, and I would have not been happy with it in the end anyway. So I went for another attempt instead, and this time using different colors and a different technique, and hopefully reach a much better outcome, and obviously bearing in mind not to overheat the oven this time. I have a tiny portion again, but here, as you can see last time, this was the dark color. This time actually I used the yellow from Soak Rochford. Here you can see I've got a slightly smaller portion again. This was going to contain the blue sky mica, as well as some charcoal again, to again create quite a dark shade of blue. And my main batch was going to contain just the sky blue mica. This time my major color was supposed to be sky blue with a bit of shades in terms of darker color and a splash of yellow in between to create some lines within the soap. The tiny amount I just mixed in quickly with my little whisk. And then I added the sky blue mica and the charcoal to the bigger portion, but not the biggest of my entire batch. And finally, I added the sky blue mica to the biggest portion of my batch. For this one, I wanted a really rich blue. I wanted it to be a strong color, but I didn't want to pour in too much right from the start. So I started with a little bit and just kept adding and adding more to it. Here you can see the darkest shade of blue. It's a slightly dirty blue color containing the charcoal and the sky blue mica. And this one here is just the blue mica. Still, I'm not completely happy with the shade I've got here. I know that the oven process curing will change a little bit in terms of the color, but it still wasn't that shade that I was after, so I kept adding a little bit more to this. As this is just a soap for the Soap Challenge Club, I wasn't too concerned about exact quantities because I knew I was never going to give away or sell the soap. It is none of my assessed recipes, so I was happy to just be able to experiment with exactly the shades I really wanted to create without having to worry about how much exactly I used of what. But of course, this soap will never get sold or given away to anyone. Now that I had my three colors, my blue, my darker blue and my yellow, I went for in the pot swirl. I dropped my darker blue with the charcoal into the main blue, into the main mix, and then drop from quite a height, drop the yellow in so you would really go through all the entire mix. In hindsight, it didn't go quite far enough, but to be honest, if this was ever a soap I would make, I would have a bigger batch and the colors would mix up a lot more because there would be more weight going in. Now, whilst I was waiting for the batch to thicken up a little bit, I prepped my molds. This time I didn't actually use any Himalayan sea salt because I wasn't sure whether the pink shade would really work with these colors here. I also decided against using some fine sea salt. After my last attempt, I just wasn't quite sure that the fine sea salt would actually add anything valuable to my final design, so I decided to skip that as well and literally just stick to the coarse sea salt. The reason why there are two different shades here is that I used two different containers and added some Milky Way white mica to one container, some Asteroid Gold mica to the other, added a little bit of rubbing alcohol and literally really mixed my sea salt into these two different shades of mica to create these two different golden and silver bright looking designs. I was also very happy for there to be some individual little parts of sea salt in the center, but overall I avoided the center. I think in hindsight it might have been nice to have had a couple of the soap molds adding a little bit more to the center as well, but this gave it some consistency with all my designs in the end looking very similar. And this is it, my molds are prepped. My mix looks pretty thick by now, just about right I hope to pour in. I'm hoping that the yellow is not just sitting on the top, but we will soon find out. Again, I'm trying to start pouring into the center first, avoiding the actual sold pieces to make sure that they don't get moved around too much. At this point, I'm thinking there is a little bit too much yellow at the top, so it would have been nicer to have mixed it in a little bit more. Maybe if I had just given it a little stir with a spatula, that may have actually helped this a lot. You can see that the mix is getting slightly thicker at this point, and I'm thinking I may need to speed this up a touch. You can also see that actually this is getting darker and darker in terms of color. The yellow has pretty much disappeared, so I do know that next time I would have to mix in the yellow either halfway through or just make sure that the mix is thinner or stir it in a little bit more with a spatula. And this completes my second attempt of this month's soap challenge. I'm quite happy with the result. I even managed to squeeze out a little bit for one of my stone shapes. And here it is, fresh out of the mold. This is my cold process crystal soap that I am going to enter into this month's soap challenge club. It isn't completely finished yet because this month we're allowed to add some mica lines to the top of the soap. Now I'm using a standard kitchen knife here. This is maybe not the best option, but I didn't have a carving knife and it actually worked quite all right for me. So I'm trying to add some mica lines going with the natural lines of the soap pattern In some of my soaps, maybe the lines would have been better as slightly more straight lines and not quite as bendy to create a slightly more natural look, but I'm quite happy with how it worked out. I'm using the same gold mica that I used for the crystals on the side. And I know I'm going over the lines here. This was to make sure that all the carved out area was really covered. But that's fine because I'm using a bit of kitchen roll at the end to wipe any excess mica away. Overall, I'm really happy with the finished look of the soap. I think the blue as the main colour works very well. It's a nice strong colour and complements the gold mica on the salt crystals very well. I also like the yellow lines that come through in places and give the soap an, I hope, slightly more natural look. If you want to see the kind of stone this resembles, then look up, I hope I'm saying that right, lapis lazuli. That's the kind of stone I was after. All I need to add are a few more lines that I need to fill in with mica down the side and the couple that I'd added on the top. And then to finish it off, you can see obviously those crystals are gold already, but I just want to touch up a few of them just to give them a little bit more of sparkle. And here it is, the finished soap. I've learned so much again this month. My first attempt wasn't bad at all. It was a good experiment with the different salts and the purple colours. In hindsight, of course, the temperature in the oven ruined the design, but also I don't think that the purple worked as well as I'd hoped. It was not a very natural purple colour. Expecting the slightly thicker traced portions to mix well in the mould was probably also a miscalculation at my end, and something that I rectified in my second attempt. And as we can see, mixing colours in the beaker worked so much better. However, as this month's challenge had been so much fun, I decided to go for a third attempt, not because the second one had been a fail, it worked out beautifully, but because I wanted to try something very different. I chose a rose fragrance from JAS, which is a beautifully smelling fragrance. However, I would not recommend using it for soap. You will see why in a minute. I also chose Cosmic Red Mica. I wanted to use that in small quantities, mixed in with a little bit of burlesque pink, which actually in the end I didn't need at all because I was really happy with the Cosmic Red, the way it looked in really small quantities. I also used coarse sea salt again, mixed with my Milky Way white. And in this case, again, I used the Himalayan pink because it was the pink colours that I was after. For this attempt, I split my whole batch into two. Half of it I kept white. Again, it had a little bit of titanium dioxide mixed in to make it really quite nice, solid white. And the other half had some Cosmic Red Mica added to it. As you can see, it creates a really, really pretty pink quite quickly, which is why I decided against adding the burlesque pink. The reason why I tried a new fragrance here was that this was a perfect opportunity to try a new fragrance on a relatively small batch to see how a fragrance reacts in my mix. As I said, it didn't work out very well at all, but it's always good to try those new fragrances on small batches. And in a way, it's a shame because I couldn't really get the end product that I wanted due to the fragrance. But at least I now know not to use this in a proper big batch. Here is that lovely pink shade. I'm really happy with that. This is my white. Again, I'm very happy with this. And this is where things are starting to go wrong. I'm adding the fragrance oil. I'm leaving this in so you can see what happens if you have a fragrance oil that accelerates trace. It looks okay here, but you can probably start to tell from my hand movements I'm starting to go a little bit nervous here. I'm pouring the pink in. Again, it's supposed to mix nicely and it's starting to sit on top already. I've got my stone molds ready. They have got the Himalayan pink salt in them and a little bit of the white salt. Here you can see what happens when you have got a fragrance oil that really accelerates trace. It is not a pretty sight, but I wanted to show you in case you have not come across this. It is not pretty. It is messy, slightly upsetting. It really doesn't work. But hey ho, here we are. I have managed to squeeze that whole thick batter in there. I will put it in the oven and see what happens. And actually the finished product isn't too bad after all. It is, of course, missing that dent in the center where the salts were and where they should have created that really nice crystal design. This didn't happen because I had to push the mix right into my mold because I essentially had soap on a stick due to the fragrance oil. The colors were fine, the consistency was initially fine, the oven temperature was fine, but it was the wrong fragrance oil to make this work.